The twins stood in the doorway of what remained of the barn, their breath forming clouds in the iron-cold air. Ethan held the letter in his gloved hand, the paper brittle from the frost, the ink almost illegible. Their great-uncle, a man whose name they had never heard, had left them this land. The building before them was a skeleton. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and entire sections of the outer walls had rotted away, leaving gaps through which the wind howled. Inside, the floor was strewn with moldy hay, and the ladder to the hayloft hung in 2 pieces, useless. 3 cows stood in a corner, shivering, their ribs visible beneath their hides. The animals had been abandoned by whoever had left this place, and now they were the twins' inheritance just as much as the land itself. Ethan looked at his sister. Sophia's face was set, her jaw clenched. She was not crying. Neither of them had cried since the orphanage had handed them the letter and told them to leave. The barn was uninhabitable. The wind cut through it, as if there were no walls at all. The cows would die within a few days if left here, and the twins would follow them soon after. There was no money for repairs. The neighbors were unwilling to lend tools or help. The nearest town was a day's walk away, and the people there had already made it clear that orphans were not welcome among them. Sophia crouched down and pressed her palm to the floor. The wood was damp and soft from rot, but beneath it she felt something solid, stone. She knocked her knuckles against the boards and heard the dull echo of space below. Ethan knelt beside her, and they pried up a section of the floor with their fingers. Beneath it was a hatch, iron with a ring and ancient, the hinges thick with rust. They opened it. A ladder descended into darkness. Sophia went down first, holding an oil lantern they had taken from the orphanage. The cellar was deep and cool, the walls of packed earth reinforced with fieldstones. The ceiling was arched, the stone laid without mortar, and the air was dry. It smelled of clay and old wood, but without mold, without water seeping through the walls. The space was large, much larger than the twins had expected. Ethan joined her at the bottom of the ladder, and they stood together in the amber light of the lantern. The cellar was well built, and though it had been abandoned for years, it had not collapsed. Sophia ran her hand over the stone. The walls were thick, insulated by the earth itself. Here the wind did not reach. Here the cold was bearable. Ethan walked the perimeter of the cellar, counting his steps. The space was nearly 20 feet across, and perhaps 15 feet deep. There were wooden supports propping up the ceiling, old but still sturdy. In one corner a narrow chimney rose to the surface, its opening blackened with old soot. Someone had once heated this space. Sophia set the lantern on the floor and sat down beside it. She pulled the letter from her coat and read it again by the light. Their great-uncle had been a bachelor, a man who had worked this land alone for decades before his death. The letter said nothing about the cellar, but now it was clear that he had known about it, perhaps had even used it. The twins harbored no illusions about the winter ahead. The barn above was useless. They could not repair it without tools and lumber, and even if they could, the work would take months. But the cellar was different. The cellar was whole. Ethan crouched beside his sister, and they spoke in low voices, their words careful and deliberate. They could live underground. They could bring the cows down. The cellar was large enough to divide into sections, and the stone walls would hold the heat of their bodies and a small fire. This was not a solution anyone else would have considered. This was not a solution the people from town would approve of, but it was the only solution they had. Sophia nodded. Ethan nodded. They stood and climbed back up the ladder. The cows still stood in the corner of the barn, heads lowered, breathing shallow. The twins approached them and laid their hands on the animals' necks. The fur was coarse and cold. Sophia whispered to the nearest cow, her voice steady. They would not let them die. They would not let themselves die. They had survived the orphanage, and they would survive this. The first task was to widen the hatch. The opening was too narrow for the cows to descend, and the ladder was too steep and fragile to bear their weight. Ethan and Sophia worked together, prying up floorboards around the hatch until they had cleared a space nearly 4 feet square. They salvaged boards from the collapsed sections of the barn and used them to build a ramp, angling it down into the cellar at a grade gentle enough for the animals to navigate. The wood was old and splintered, but they lashed the boards together with rope and tested the structure with their own weight before attempting to lead the cows down. The ramp held. Sophia descended first, holding the lantern, and Ethan coaxed the first cow toward the opening. The animal resisted, its eyes rolling white, but Ethan spoke to it in a low, calm voice and pressed his shoulder against its side. The cow took one step, then another, and then it was on the ramp, its hooves scraping against the wood. Sophia guided it down with her free hand, and the animal reached the cellar floor without injury. They brought the other two cows down the same way, one at a time. And when all three were safely below, the twins stood together and looked at what they had done. The cows stood close together in the center of the cellar, their breath visible in the lantern light. The space felt smaller now, crowded, but the animals were out of the wind. That was enough for now. The twins went back up and began the work of organizing the cellar. They carried down every useful item they could find in the barn: a rusty axe, a coil of rope, a bucket with a crack in the bottom that could still hold liquid if poured carefully. They found a small cast iron stove in a corner of the barn, half buried under hay, and together they lifted it and lowered it down the ramp on a makeshift sling of rope. The stove was heavy, and the work left their hands raw. But they did not stop. They could not afford to stop. The cellar needed to be divided. The cows could not share the same space where the twins would sleep and eat. Sophia sketched a plan in the dirt with a stick, marking out zones. The cows would stay in the back, farthest from the ladder. The twins would sleep in the front, near the entrance, where they could monitor the animals and the air. The stove would go in the corner between the two zones, close enough to warm both, but positioned so the smoke would rise through the old chimney. Ethan found a stack of rough-cut planks in the ruins of a shed behind the barn. The wood was weathered but still strong, and he carried the planks down one by one. Sophia used the axe to sharpen the ends into stakes, and together they drove the stakes into the packed earth floor to create a partition. They lashed horizontal rails across the stakes, building a fence that reached from floor to ceiling. The partition was not perfect, but it was solid. It would keep the cows contained and give the twins their own space. They spread straw on the floor of the cow zone, layering it thick to insulate the animals from the cold earth below. Ethan fashioned a feed trough from a split log, hollowing it out with the axe and setting it against the back wall. Sophia filled a bucket with snow and set it near the stove to melt into drinking water for the animals. The cows watched as they worked, their ears flicking, their eyes calm now that they were out of the wind. In the front section of the cellar, the twins built a raised platform for their bed. They scavenged planks from the barn floor and laid them across 2 stacks of fieldstone to create a frame. Over this, they spread a straw mattress they had brought from the orphanage, thin and musty, but better than sleeping on bare earth. They hung a curtain of burlap sacks from a rope line to give themselves a measure of privacy. It was not much, but it was theirs. Sophia set up a small table from a salvaged board and 2 stacked crates. On it she placed a tin cup, a candle stub, and the letter from their great-uncle. The letter was all they had from him, and she wanted it there where she could see it. The stove was the key to their survival. Without heat, the cellar would become a grave. Ethan examined the old chimney, tracing its path upward through the earth to the surface. The opening was clogged with debris, and he spent an hour clearing it with a stick in hand, pulling out clumps of rotted leaves and the desiccated body of a bird. When the chimney was clear, he tested it by lighting a small fire in the stove and watching the smoke rise. The draft was weak, but it was there. The smoke climbed the chimney and dispersed somewhere above, invisible against the gray sky. Sophia gathered fuel. There was no coal to be had, but the barn was full of old wood, and she broke apart the least rotten planks and carried them down. She also collected dried manure from the barn floor, knowing it would burn slowly and give off heat. It was not pleasant work, but she did not complain. Ethan built a small fire in the stove, feeding it carefully, keeping the flame low. The heat spread slowly through the cellar, and within an hour, the air warmed enough that the twins could remove their outer coats. The cows shifted in their straw, their breathing easier now. The twins sat together near the stove and ate a meal of hard bread and frozen turnips they had brought from town. The bread was stale, and the turnips were bitter, but they chewed slowly and said nothing. They were alive. The cows were alive. That was all that mattered. As the fire burned, Sophia noticed condensation forming on the stone walls. She frowned and touched the moisture with her fingertips. The cellar was warming, but the walls were still cold, and the temperature difference was creating dampness. If they were not careful, mold would take hold, and the air would become unbreathable. Ethan saw her concern and nodded. They would need to manage the heat carefully, keeping the fire small and steady rather than hot and intense. They would need to ventilate the space, opening the hatch periodically to let fresh air in and stale air out. The twins worked in silence, adjusting the stove, rearranging the partition, testing the weight of the platform bed. They moved with the efficiency of people who had learned to survive on very little, who had learned to make do. Every decision was deliberate. Every action had a purpose. When the light outside began to fade, Ethan climbed up to the barn and closed the hatch most of the way, leaving it cracked open just enough for air to circulate. Cold rushed in through the gap, but it was manageable, a thin stream rather than a torrent. He descended the ladder and joined Sophia by the stove. They sat together and listened to the wind howling above. The barn creaked and groaned under the weight of the snow, but down here in the cellar, the sound was muted, distant. The cows lay down in their straw, their bodies pressed together for warmth. One of them lowed softly, a sound of contentment. Sophia smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since leaving the orphanage. The next morning, the twins walked to the nearest town. The journey took most of the day, and the road was treacherous with ice. They carried nothing but a small sack of turnips to trade, in the hope that someone might be willing to help them. The town was called Frostwood, a name that suited it well. The buildings were low and weathered, the streets rutted with frozen mud. The people who lived there were hard and suspicious, their faces lined with the same cold that gripped the land. Ethan and Sophia went to the general store and spoke to the owner, a man named Mr. Harlan. They explained their situation as simply as they could. They had inherited a farm. The barn was in ruins. They were living below ground with the cows to survive the winter. They needed tools, lumber, and advice. Mr. Harlan stared at them for a long moment, then laughed. It was not a kind laugh. He called to the other men in the store, and soon a small crowd had gathered. The twins stood in the center of the room and endured their mockery. The men of Frostwood did not hide their contempt. One of them, Mr. Barrett, the blacksmith with arms like tree trunks, shook his head and spat into the stove. Living underground with cows, he said. It was the stupidest thing he had ever heard. The animals would foul the air. The twins would suffocate or freeze or both. Another man, Mr. Grayson, a farmer with a gray beard, said that only fools would try to winter below ground. The earth was cold, he said. It would suck the warmth right out of them. They would be dead by spring, and the cows with them. Mr. Harlan leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. He told the twins that if they had any sense, they would abandon the farm and return to the orphanage. The land was worthless. The barn was worthless. They were children, and children had no business trying to manage livestock. Sophia stood very still, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not argue. She did not defend their plan. She simply listened. Ethan did the same. When the men had finished speaking, Sophia thanked them for their time and turned to leave. Mr. Harlan stopped her. He said that if they insisted on this foolishness, he would sell them a bag of oats and some rope, but he would not sell them on credit. Cash only. The twins had no cash. They left the store empty-handed. Outside, the wind cut through their coats like a blade. Ethan looked at his sister, and she looked back at him. They did not speak. They did not need to. They walked back to the farm in silence, their boots crunching through the snow. When they reached the barn, they descended into the cellar and closed the hatch behind them. The cows were waiting, their eyes calm and trusting. The twins fed them the last of the turnips and checked the stove. The fire was still burning, low and steady. They sat together on the edge of the platform bed and took off their boots. Their feet were numb with cold, and they rubbed them until the feeling returned. The twins did not waste time on bitterness. The people of Frostwood had made their judgment, and there was nothing to be gained by dwelling on it. Instead, Ethan and Sophia turned their attention to the work that remained. The cellar was functional, but it was not yet sustainable. They needed more food for the cows, more fuel for the stove, and a way to manage the waste that was beginning to accumulate in the cow zone. Ethan took the axe and climbed back up to the surface. The forest beyond the barn was dense with pine and birch, and he spent the morning felling dead trees and dragging them back to the farm. He cut the trunks into manageable lengths and lowered them down the ramp into the cellar. Sophia split the wood with steady, rhythmic strikes, stacking the pieces near the stove. The work was exhausting, but it gave them a sense of control. They were not helpless. They were not waiting to be saved. They were solving the problem themselves. The cows needed more than turnips. Sophia knew that hay was the staple of winter feeding, but the moldy clumps in the barn were useless. She searched the property and found a small shed half buried in snow. Inside were 3 bales of hay, old but still dry. She carried them down one at a time, her arms aching, and spread the hay in the feed trough. The cows ate eagerly, their jaws working, their tails flicking. Ethan rigged a drainage system for the manure. He dug a shallow trench in the earth floor of the cow zone, sloping it toward a corner where he had excavated a small sump pit. Manure and urine would flow into the pit, and he could haul it up to the surface periodically and spread it on the frozen ground. It was not a perfect system, but it kept the air in the cellar from becoming unbearable. The twins also built a ventilation routine. Every morning, they opened the hatch fully for an hour, allowing fresh air to flood the cellar and push out the stale breath of the cows and the smoke from the stove. The days settled into a rhythm. The twins woke before dawn and tended to the cows first, feeding them hay and checking their water. They kept the stove burning day and night, feeding it small amounts of wood and dried manure to maintain a steady temperature. They ate sparingly, rationing the food they had brought from town and supplementing it with the few vegetables they found in the cellar's old storage alcoves. The work was constant, but it was not chaotic. Every task had its place, and the twins moved through them with quiet efficiency. Sophia kept a ledger on the small table, tracking the food they consumed, the fuel they burned, and the condition of the cows. She wrote in pencil, her handwriting neat and precise. The numbers told a story of survival, and she found comfort in their clarity. Ethan repaired the ladder, replacing the weakest rungs with fresh-cut wood. He also reinforced the ramp, adding cross beams to distribute the weight more evenly. He worked slowly, testing each modification before moving on to the next. One evening, as they sat by the stove, Sophia spoke. She said that the cellar was warmer than the orphanage had ever been. Ethan nodded. It was true. The stone walls held the heat, and the earth itself insulated them from the worst of the cold. Down here, they were safe. Winter deepened. Snow piled against the barn above, and the wind howled day and night. The twins rarely ventured to the surface except to gather firewood and check the chimney. The cellar became their entire world, a small pocket of warmth and light in a landscape of ice. The cows grew accustomed to the space. They lay down together in the straw, their breath rising in soft clouds, and they chewed their cud with slow, patient movements. The twins learned the rhythms of the animals, the way they shifted and groaned, the way they lowed when the feed trough was empty. It was a kind of partnership, each relying on the other to endure. The blizzard came in the 4th week of winter. It arrived without warning, a wall of white that swallowed the sky. The wind screamed across the land, tearing at the barn and piling snow higher than a man's head. Above ground, the temperature plummeted. The twins heard the barn timbers cracking under the weight of ice, the sharp reports echoing down through the hatch. They closed the opening and sealed the edges with rags to keep the cold from pouring in. For 3 days, they did not leave the cellar. The stove burned constantly, and they fed it every scrap of wood they had. The cows huddled together, their eyes wide but calm. The twins sat close to the fire, their blankets wrapped around their shoulders, and waited for the storm to pass. On the 3rd night, Ethan woke to the sound of pounding on the hatch. He sat up, his heart racing, and listened. The pounding came again, frantic and desperate. Sophia woke beside him, and together they climbed the ladder. Ethan pushed the hatch open, and a man fell through, landing hard on the ramp. He was covered in snow, his face blue with cold, his breath coming in ragged gasps. 2 more people followed him down, a woman and a child, both shaking violently. They collapsed on the cellar floor, too weak to stand. The man looked up at Ethan and Sophia. He was one of the men from Frostwood, Mr. Barrett, the blacksmith who had mocked them in the store. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Sophia knelt beside him and pulled the blanket from her own shoulders, wrapping it around the woman and child. Ethan stoked the fire, adding wood until the flames roared. Heat filled the cellar, and the 3 newcomers began to thaw. Mr. Barrett finally found his voice. He said that the town had been cut off by the storm. The roads were impassable, and several homes had collapsed under the weight of snow. People were freezing. He had remembered the twins and their underground shelter, and he had led his family here in desperation. Sophia brought water and held the cup to the woman's lips. The woman drank, her hands shaking, and whispered her thanks. The child, a boy no older than 8, stared at the cows with wide eyes. Ethan gave him a piece of bread, and the boy ate it in silence. Mr. Barrett sat by the stove, his head in his hands. He said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong to mock them. He said he had not believed the cellar would work. But here they were, warm and alive, while the rest of the town was dying. Sophia did not respond to the apology. She simply moved to the cow zone and brought back more straw, spreading it on the floor to make a place for the newcomers to rest. Ethan checked the stove and adjusted the draft. The fire was burning hot now, and the cellar was warmer than it had been in weeks. Mr. Barrett looked at the twins, his eyes red with exhaustion and shame. He asked if they would help the others. He said there were more people in Frostwood who needed shelter, families with children, elders who could not survive another night in the cold. Ethan and Sophia looked at each other. They did not speak, but the decision was already made. Sophia nodded. Ethan pulled on his coat. They climbed the ladder together and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit them like a fist, and snow stung their faces. But they did not turn back. They walked toward Frostwood, their heads down, their hands linked. The town was a mile away, and the drifts were deep. But they knew the way. When they reached the first house, they pounded on the door. A woman opened it, her face gaunt and frightened. Sophia told her to gather her family and follow them. The woman hesitated, then called to her husband and children. They came out into the storm, wrapped in whatever blankets they could find, and the twins led them back to the farm. They made 3 more trips that night, each time bringing back another family. By dawn, the cellar was crowded with people. There were 15 in all, huddled together in the warmth, their faces pale but alive. The cows stood at the back, undisturbed by the press of bodies. The stove burned steadily, and the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. The twins moved among the families, distributing what little food they had and checking that everyone was warm enough. No one spoke much. Gratitude was silent, conveyed in the way people met their eyes and nodded. Mr. Barrett sat near the stove, his wife and son asleep against his shoulder. He watched Ethan and Sophia work, and when they passed near him, he reached out and touched Sophia's arm. He said he would never forget what they had done. Sophia looked at him, her expression calm. She said that goodness was not a choice. It was a necessity. If they did not help each other, none of them would survive. Mr. Barrett nodded and said nothing more. The storm raged for 2 more days, and then it broke. The wind died, and the sky cleared to a pale cold blue. The people in the cellar began to stir, preparing to return to their homes. The twins helped them up the ladder one by one, steadying the children and the elders. Mr. Barrett was the last to leave. He stood at the top of the ramp and looked back at Ethan and Sophia. He said that when spring came, the people of Frostwood would help them rebuild the barn. He said they would bring lumber and tools and labor, and they would make the farm whole again. Sophia smiled. She thanked him, but she did not say whether they would accept the help. It was a decision for another day. Mr. Barrett climbed out into the snow, and the twins closed the hatch. They descended the ladder and stood together in the quiet cellar. The cows were chewing their hay, their breath rising in soft clouds. The stove was still burning. Ethan and Sophia sat down by the fire and took off their coats. They were tired, but they were content. Winter was not over, but they had proven what they needed to prove. The cellar worked, the design held, and when the storm had come, they had not turned away the people who had once turned them away. Sophia opened the ledger and made a note of the days that had passed and the lives they had sheltered. Ethan fed the stove and checked the cows one last time. Then they lay down on their platform bed, pulled the blankets over themselves, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of those who have done what was necessary.